Principia Ethica by G.E. Moore, quotes. Principia Ethica by G.E. Moore is a groundbreaking work in moral philosophy that challenges traditional ethical theories and introduces the concept of the naturalistic fallacy. Moore argues that good is an indefinable, simple quality that cannot be reduced to natural properties such as pleasure or desire. The book critiques utilitarianism and other ethical systems that attempt to equate goodness with measurable or natural properties, advocating instead for an understanding of intrinsic value that recognizes the complexity of moral judgments. Moore's analysis emphasizes the importance of distinguishing between what is good in itself and what is good as a means, laying the foundation for much of modern ethical thought and analytic philosophy. Quote 1. Ethics is undoubtedly concerned with the question of what good conduct is. But, being concerned with this, it obviously does not start at the beginning, unless it is prepared to tell us what is good as well as what is conduct. This quote emphasizes that ethics is not merely about identifying good conduct, but must first define what good means. Without understanding what is inherently good, discussions about good conduct remain incomplete. Ethics needs a foundation of what good itself is before assessing actions as good or bad. Quote 2. If I am asked, what is good? My answer is that good is good, and that is the end of the matter. Or if I am asked, how is good to be defined? My answer is that it cannot be defined, and that is all I have to say about it. Here, Moore asserts that good is a simple, indefinable concept. Just as we cannot fully explain what yellow is to someone unfamiliar with it, the notion of good cannot be broken down into simpler components. It is a fundamental, self-evident idea in ethics. Quote 3. Definitions which describe the real nature of the object or notion denoted by a word are only possible when the object or notion is something complex. Moore explains that we can define complex ideas by breaking them into parts, like how we describe a horse by listing its characteristics. However, simple notions like good cannot be defined this way because they are not composed of parts, but are instead foundational concepts. Quote 4. But the main object of ethics, as a systematic science, is to give correct reasons for thinking that this or that is good. And unless this question be answered, such reasons cannot be given. This quote stresses the importance of understanding the fundamental concept of good for ethics. Without clarity on what good means, ethical discussions and justifications for why something is good or bad become baseless and ineffective. Quote 5. That propositions about the good are all of them synthetic and never analytic, and that is plainly no trivial matter. Moore is making an important distinction between synthetic and analytic propositions in ethics. He suggests that statements about what is good are synthetic, meaning they are based on experience rather than logic or definitions, which complicates efforts to define or understand them purely through reasoning. Quote 6. Many people appear to think that if we say pleasure and intelligence are good, or if we say only pleasure and intelligence are good, we are defining good. Here, Moore points out the common mistake of thinking that when we describe certain things like pleasure or intelligence as good, we are defining the concept of good itself. However, saying that something is good does not provide a definition of the term good, which remains a simple and indefinable notion. Quote 7. In fact, if it is not the case that good denotes something simple and indefinable, only two alternatives are possible. Either it is a complex, a given whole, about the correct analysis of which there may be disagreement, or else it means nothing at all, and there is no such subject as ethics. This quote highlights the central argument of Moore's philosophy, which is that the concept of good must be simple and indefinable. If it were not, ethical debates would revolve around its complexity or dissolve entirely. eliminating the very possibility of ethical discussion. Moore uses this argument to affirm the unique position of good in ethical reasoning. Quote 8. Why? If good is good and indefinable, should I be held to deny that pleasure is good? Is there any difficulty in holding both to be true at once? On the contrary, there is no meaning in saying that pleasure is good unless good is something different from pleasure. In this passage, Moore argues that while pleasure may be good, the two concepts are not synonymous. Goodness remains a unique, indefinable quality, and pleasure, while often considered good, does not define what goodness is. This distinction is crucial to avoid conflating different values or concepts within ethical philosophy. Quote 9. But, if we carry the investigation further and ask ourselves, is it good to desire A? It is apparent, on a little reflection, that this question is itself as intelligible as the original question, is A good? Moore is illustrating how attempts to define good by desire or other complex notions lead to further questioning. Each layer of questioning reveals that the meaning of good cannot be reduced to simpler ideas or desires. It must be accepted as a fundamental, self-evident notion that resists further definition. Quote 10. The direct object of ethics is knowledge, and not practice, and anyone who uses the naturalistic fallacy has certainly not fulfilled this first object, however correct his practical principles may be. Here, Moore clarifies that the goal of ethics is to seek knowledge about what is good, rather than just guiding practical action. Falling into the naturalistic fallacy, where good is equated with some natural property, undermines this intellectual pursuit, even if the ethical outcomes remain valid. Quote 11. It is, therefore, extremely important to distinguish these two kinds of possible judgments. Both may be expressed in the same language. In both cases, we commonly say, such and such a thing is good. Moore stresses the importance of distinguishing between judgments about things being good in themselves and good as a means. Although both are expressed similarly, they refer to fundamentally different kinds of ethical evaluations, and confusing them leads to misunderstandings in moral philosophy. Quote 12. Everybody is constantly aware of this notion, although he may never become aware at all that it is different from other notions of which he is also aware. Moore asserts that the concept of good is something people intuitively understand, even if they do not consciously differentiate it from other concepts. This unconscious familiarity with good underscores its simplicity and foundational role in ethical reasoning. Quote 13. It must at least be admitted that the questions what is best in itself and what will bring about the best possible are utterly distinct, that both belong to the actual subject matter of ethics, and that the more clearly distinct questions are distinguished, the better is our chance of answering both correctly. Here, Moore distinguishes between two essential ethical inquiries, determining what is intrinsically good and understanding what actions or circumstances will bring about the best outcomes. Recognizing the difference between these two questions is critical for properly addressing ethical issues, as confusing them leads to unclear or incorrect conclusions. Quote 14. The value of a whole must not be assumed to be the same as the sum of the values of its parts. Moore introduces the idea that the value of a whole can differ significantly from the sum of its parts. In ethics, this means that while individual actions or things may have value on their own, their combined effect or value within a larger context could be much greater or lesser than the simple sum of their parts. This emphasizes the importance of considering the broader context when making ethical evaluations. Quote 15. It is certain that a good thing may exist in such a relation to another good thing that the value of the whole thus formed is immensely greater than the sum of the values of the two good things. This quote underscores how the combination of two individually good things can result in a whole that is far more valuable than the two separate parts. The interaction and relationship between these good elements enhance the overall value, which illustrates the complexity of ethical judgments when assessing entire situations rather than isolated components. Quote 16. The existence of the part may itself have no more intrinsic value than that of the means. Moore points out that even though a part of a whole might be necessary for the whole to exist, that part does not necessarily have intrinsic value on its own. The value of the whole is what matters, not the individual value of the parts. This highlights a distinction between something being necessary versus being valuable in itself. Quote 17. To say that a thing is an organic whole is generally understood to imply that its parts are related to one another and to itself as means to end. It is also understood to imply that they have a property described in some such phrase as that they have no meaning or significance apart from the whole. In this passage, Moore critiques the idea of organic wholes as being misunderstood. He clarifies that while the parts of an organic whole may contribute to the value of the whole, this does not mean they lack meaning or value on their own. He refines the concept by stressing that parts have distinct values and relationships, even when part of a greater whole. Quote 18. The peculiarity of ethics is not that it investigates assertions about human conduct, but that it investigates assertions about that property of things which is denoted by the term good, and the converse property denoted by the term bad. Moore emphasizes that the core focus of ethics is not solely on evaluating actions or behaviors, but on understanding and defining the fundamental properties of good and bad. Ethics, therefore, seeks to establish the truth of these properties in things, which forms the basis for making moral judgments. Quote 19. The peculiar predicate, by reference to which the sphere of ethics must be defined, is simple, unanalyzable, indefinable. Moore asserts that the concept of good is unique and cannot be reduced to simpler components. It is a fundamental and indefinable concept, much like colors or other basic sensations that cannot be broken down or further explained. This is key to Moore's rejection of attempts to define good through naturalistic or metaphysical terms. Quote 20. Naturalistic theories I call naturalistic. I have thus appropriated the name naturalism to a particular method of approaching ethics, a method which, strictly understood, is inconsistent with the possibility of any ethics whatsoever. Moore argues that naturalistic ethical theories, which attempt to define good in terms of natural properties, undermine the entire field of ethics. By equating good with something like pleasure, health, or other measurable attributes, these theories reduce ethics to a scientific or empirical field, which is incompatible with the deeper philosophical inquiry into what good truly is. Quote 21. The fact is that in the very words health and disease, we do commonly include the notion that the one is good and the other bad. This quote highlights how everyday language often conflates natural or normal with good. Moore points out that while people may associate health with goodness and disease with badness, this is not a philosophically valid assumption. He insists that good must be evaluated separately from natural or normal states. Quote 22. Good does not, by definition, mean anything that is natural, and it is therefore always an open question whether anything that is natural is good. Moore emphasizes that what is natural is not inherently good. He challenges the common belief that natural things, such as health or survival, are automatically considered good. Instead, he asserts that whether something natural is good must always be critically examined and not assumed based on its naturalness. Quote 23. It may be true, indeed, that by healthy we do commonly imply good, but that only shows that when we so use the word, we do not mean the same thing by it as the thing which is meant in medical science. Moore argues that when people use healthy to mean good, they are not speaking in scientific terms. In medical science, health is a state of being normal or functional, but in everyday language, people often attach ethical or moral value to health. Moore suggests that this is a confusion of terms, and that the ethical implications of health should be questioned separately from its biological definition. Quote 24. All that the evolution hypothesis tells us is that certain kinds of conduct are more evolved than others, and this is, in fact, all that Mr. Spencer has attempted to prove in the 2 chapters concerned. In this quote, Moore critiques Herbert Spencer's use of evolutionary theory to support ethical conclusions. He emphasizes that evolution only explains how certain behaviors or traits have developed, but it does not inherently assign ethical value to those behaviors. Moore points out that Spencer mistakenly conflates the concept of more evolved with better, without providing a proper ethical argument to justify this leap. Quote 25. We must not therefore be frightened by the assertion that a thing is natural into the admission that it is good. Good does not, by definition, mean anything that is natural, and it is therefore always an open question whether anything that is natural is good. Here, Moore cautions against the naturalistic fallacy, the assumption that what is natural is inherently good. He argues that the mere fact of something being natural does not automatically grant it ethical value. Each instance of what is considered natural must still be critically evaluated to determine if it is good. Quote 26. That life is good or bad, according as it does or does not bring a surplus of agreeable feeling. In this quote, Moore highlights Spencer's assertion that life's value is determined by whether it brings more pleasure than pain. Spencer ties ethical goodness to the experience of pleasurable feelings, suggesting that a good life is one that maximizes positive feelings. Moore scrutinizes this hedonistic view, questioning whether pleasure should be regarded as the sole measure of goodness. Quote 27. The survival of the fittest does not mean, as one might suppose, the survival of what is fittest to fulfill a good purpose, best adapted to a good end. At the last, it means merely the survival of the fittest to survive. Moore criticizes the misconception that evolution inherently leads to morally superior outcomes. He clarifies that evolutionary success is not about fulfilling a good ethical purpose, but simply about survival. This statement challenges the idea that what survives or evolves is necessarily good, in any ethical sense. Quote 28. Mr. Spencer implies that of 2 quantities of life, which gave an equal amount of pleasure, the larger would nevertheless be preferable to the less. This passage reveals Moore's critique of Spencer's conflicting views on pleasure and life. While Spencer ties ethical value to the amount of pleasure, he also suggests that more life is preferable, even if the amount of pleasure is the same. Moore points out the inconsistency in Spencer's reasoning, as it seems to value life itself in addition to pleasure, which contradicts a purely hedonistic approach. Quote 29. It is plain that Mr. Spencer here rejects the naturalistic identification of better with more evolved, but it is possible that he is influenced by another naturalistic identification, that of good with pleasant. Moore notes that while Spencer rejects the direct equation of better with more evolved, he still falls into a similar error by equating good with pleasant. Moore identifies this as another instance of the naturalistic fallacy, where ethical value is wrongly attributed to a natural property like pleasure, without proper justification. Quote 30. Hedonism appears in the main to be a form of naturalistic ethics. In other words, that pleasure has been so generally held to be the sole good is almost entirely due to the fact that it has seemed to be somehow involved in the definition of good, to be pointed out by the very meaning of the word. Moore argues that the widespread belief in hedonism, the idea that pleasure is the only good, stems from a misunderstanding, specifically the naturalistic fallacy. People have mistakenly assumed that the very concept of good is tied to pleasure, when in fact good is a unique and indefinable concept that cannot be reduced to any natural property like pleasure. Quote 31. It is very easy to notice the fact that we are pleased with things. The things we enjoy and the things we do not form 2 unmistakable classes, to which our attention is constantly directed. Moore points out that it is natural for people to notice the difference between what gives them pleasure and what does not. This observation often leads people to equate pleasure with goodness, making it easy to confuse approval of something with the feeling of being pleased by it. However, these two experiences, approving and enjoying, are distinct. Quote 32. Nothing is more natural than the vulgar mistake, which we find expressed in a recent book on ethics. The primary ethical fact is, we have said, that something is approved or disapproved. That is, in other words, the ideal representation of certain events in the way of sensation, perception, or idea is attended with a feeling of pleasure or of pain. In this quote, Moore highlights a common confusion in ethical thinking, where people mistakenly equate ethical approval with the feelings of pleasure or pain that accompany it. He argues that ethical approval and pleasure are different experiences, even though they are often closely related. Quote 33. By hedonism, then, I mean the doctrine that pleasure alone is good as an end. Good, in the sense which I have tried to point out as indefinable. Moore defines hedonism as the belief that pleasure is the only thing that is intrinsically good, meaning good for its own sake. He emphasizes that this definition of good is based on the idea that it cannot be further defined or reduced to simpler concepts like pleasure. Quote 34. Mill holds, then, that happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being only desirable as means to that end. This quote summarizes John Stuart Mill's view that happiness, which he defines as pleasure and the absence of pain, is the only thing that is truly desirable for its own sake. According to Mill, everything else is only valuable as a means to achieving happiness. Moore critiques this view, arguing that Mill's reasoning relies on the naturalistic fallacy. Quote 35. Mill has made as naive and artless a use of the naturalistic fallacy as anybody could desire. Good, he tells us, means desirable. And you can only find out what is desirable by seeking to find out what is actually desired. Moore criticizes Mill for committing the naturalistic fallacy by equating what is good with what is desired. He points out that just because something is desired by people does not mean it is inherently good. This confusion, according to Moore, weakens Mill's argument for hedonism. Quote 36. Pleasure alone is good as an end, good in and for itself. Moore introduces the central claim of hedonism, which holds that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, valuable for its own sake. This marks a turning point in his analysis, as he begins examining this claim, recognizing that while we cannot prove or disprove such a claim directly, we can still assess it by comparing it to other beliefs and intuitions. Quote 37. Can one pleasure be pleasanter than another, except in the sense that it gives more pleasure? Moore questions John Stuart Mill's notion of higher and lower pleasures, suggesting that the distinction between different types of pleasure is incoherent within a hedonistic framework. If pleasure is the only good, it cannot differ in quality, only in quantity. Thus, Mill's argument for quality undermines the basic tenet of hedonism. Quote 38. Mill's judgment of preference is just a judgment of that intuitional kind which I have been contending to be necessary to establish the hedonistic or any other principle. Moore points out that Mill's reliance on the preferences of experts to judge the quality of pleasures is, in fact, an intuition-based judgment. This undercuts Mill's argument for hedonism by admitting that there are other kinds of judgments beyond the simple measurement of pleasure. Quote 39. If you say pleasure, you must mean pleasure. You must mean some one thing common to all different pleasures, some one thing which may exist in different degrees, but which cannot differ in kind. In this passage, Moore argues that if we truly accept the hedonistic principle that pleasure is the only good, then all pleasures must be fundamentally the same and only differ in intensity or amount. Any attempt to argue that one type of pleasure is better than another introduces complexities that undermine the simplicity of hedonism. Quote 40. To have thus dismissed Mill's reference to quality of pleasure is therefore to have made one step in the desired direction. Here, Moore suggests that rejecting Mill's distinction between the quality of pleasures is a necessary step in refuting hedonism. By acknowledging that all pleasures are equal in kind, we avoid the contradictions in Mill's argument, thereby clarifying the flaws in the hedonistic principle. Quote 41. If we are really going to maintain that pleasure alone is good as an end, we must maintain that it is good, whether we are conscious of it or not. Moore highlights a major problem with hedonism, suggesting that if pleasure is the sole good, we would have to value it even if we were not aware of experiencing it. This absurdity challenges the idea that pleasure in isolation from consciousness can be the ultimate goal of ethical action. Quote 42. It is, in fact, always misleading to take a whole, that is valuable, or the reverse, and then to ask simply, to which of its constituents does this whole owe its value or its vileness? Moore warns that when evaluating a complex whole, it is misleading to attribute its value solely to one of its parts. He argues that a valuable whole is more than the sum of its individual components, and each part must be considered in isolation to determine its specific value. Quote 43. If consciousness of pleasure existed absolutely by itself, would a sober judgment be able to attribute much value to it? Moore challenges the idea that pleasure alone, without any additional experiences or context, could be considered valuable. He suggests that when isolated, mere consciousness of pleasure does not hold much value, emphasizing that pleasure is meaningful only when combined with other valuable experiences. Quote 44. We must ask, suppose we were conscious of pleasure only, and of nothing else, not even that we were conscious. Would that state of things, however great the quantity, be very desirable? Moore presents a thought experiment to question the desirability of pleasure when it is isolated from any other experience or awareness. He argues that pleasure alone, without awareness of it or other factors, is not something we would consider highly desirable, thus undermining the foundation of hedonism. Quote 45. Egoism, as a form of hedonism, is the doctrine which holds that we ought each of us to pursue our own greatest happiness as our ultimate end. Here, Moore defines egoism within the context of hedonism, explaining that egoism holds that one's own happiness is the ultimate goal. This self-centered approach to ethics prioritizes personal happiness as the only good, and all other actions are means to achieving that happiness. Quote 46. If it is true of any single man's interest or happiness that it ought to be his sole ultimate end, this can only mean that that man's interest or happiness is the sole good, the universal good, and the only thing that anybody ought to aim at. Moore highlights the inherent contradiction in egoism, pointing out that if an individual's happiness is considered the sole good, then, logically, that happiness must also be the universal good. This creates a paradox where multiple individuals' happiness would each claim to be the only good, leading to an absurd conclusion. Quote 47. The only possible reason that can justify any action is that by it, the greatest possible amount of what is good absolutely should be realized. Moore asserts that the justification for any action must be based on its ability to maximize the amount of absolute good, rather than being limited to personal or subjective interests. This principle contrasts with egoism, emphasizing the need to consider universal good as the foundation for ethical decision-making. Quote 48. Ethical truths follow logically from metaphysical truths, that ethics should be based on metaphysics. Moore addresses the foundational claim of metaphysical ethics, which argues that ethical truths can be derived from metaphysical propositions. This claim suggests that understanding the nature of reality is crucial to determining what is morally right or good. Moore is setting the stage to challenge this idea, indicating that ethics and metaphysics are distinct fields with different concerns. Quote 49. That which would be perfectly good is something which exists, but is not natural. That which has some characteristic possessed by a supersensible reality. This quote summarizes the central thesis of metaphysical ethics, which claims that the supreme good exists in a realm beyond the natural world and possesses qualities of a supersensible reality. Moore critiques this idea, arguing that even if such a reality exists, it does not logically follow that it defines or determines what is ethically good. Quote 50. It rests upon the failure to perceive that any truth which asserts this is good in itself is quite unique in kind, that it cannot be reduced to any assertion about reality. Moore explains that ethical truths, such as the claim that something is intrinsically good, are distinct from metaphysical truths about what exists. He argues that the attempt to derive ethical judgments from metaphysical claims is flawed because the nature of ethical statements is unique and cannot be reduced to statements about existence or reality. Quote 51. If it holds not only that such an eternal reality exists, but also, as is commonly the case, that nothing else is real, that nothing either has been, is now, or will be real in time, then truly it will follow that nothing we can do will ever bring any good to pass. Moore critiques metaphysical doctrines that claim an eternal reality is the only true reality, suggesting that this view renders human actions meaningless. If nothing in time is real, then ethical actions, actions that aim to bring about good in the world, become pointless, as they cannot affect reality in any meaningful way. Quote 52. Metaphysics can tell us anything about the future consequences of our actions beyond what can be established by ordinary inductive reasoning. Here, Moore concedes that metaphysical knowledge might have practical relevance if it could provide insights into the future consequences of our actions. However, he argues that such knowledge is speculative and does not offer a concrete foundation for ethical decision-making, as ethical truths are independent of metaphysical speculations about the future. Quote 53. What metaphysical writers commonly maintain is not merely that metaphysics can help us to decide what the effects of our actions will be, but that it can tell us which among possible effects will be good and which will be bad. Moore highlights the bold claim of metaphysical ethics, that metaphysics not only informs us about the nature of reality, but also determines what is ethically good or bad. He challenges this assertion by arguing that determining the goodness or badness of an action is an ethical question that cannot be answered by metaphysical reasoning alone. Quote 54. Kant identifies what ought to be with the law according to which a free or pure will must act, with the only kind of action which is possible for it. Moore discusses Kant's view that ethical obligation, what ought to be, is inherently tied to the nature of the free will, which acts according to its own law. Kant suggests that what is willed by a free will is necessarily good, but Moore critiques this, arguing that such a connection between freedom and ethics ultimately weakens Kant's position. Quote 55. That which makes an obligation legal, namely the fact that it is commanded by a certain kind of authority, is entirely irrelevant to a moral obligation. Moore draws a distinction between legal obligations, which depend on authority, and moral obligations, which are based on intrinsic goodness. He emphasizes that moral duties are not defined by commands from authority, but by their moral worth, independent of who or what commands them. Quote 56. It is supposed that to say that a thing is real or true is the same thing as to say that it is known in a certain way, and that the difference between the assertion that it is good and the assertion that it is real consists in the fact that whereas the latter asserts its relation to cognition, the former asserts its relation to will. Moore critiques the metaphysical tendency to equate ethical judgments, such as declaring something good, with acts of will or feeling, while equating truth or reality with acts of cognition. He argues that this is a fundamental misunderstanding, as ethical truths and metaphysical truths function differently and should not be conflated. Quote 57. Even if it be true that to think good is the same thing as to prefer, yet it is not true that what you think when you think a thing good is that you prefer it. Moore clarifies that while we often prefer what we think is good, this does not mean that goodness is defined by preference. The act of thinking something is good is different from the act of preferring it, and one does not define or explain the other. Quote 58. Being good, then, is not identical with being willed or felt in any kind of way, any more than being true is identical with being thought in any kind of way. Moore argues that goodness cannot be reduced to or defined by any kind of will or feeling, just as truth cannot be equated with the mere act of being thought. He rejects the idea that ethical judgments can be explained by psychological states or preferences, insisting that goodness is an independent quality. Quote 59. It is plain that if what is willed in a certain way were always also good, then the fact that a thing was so willed would be a criterion of its goodness. Moore critiques the idea that will could be used as a criterion for determining goodness. He argues that even if it were true that things willed in a certain way were good, this would not serve as a reliable standard for ethical judgment, as the nature of goodness cannot be reduced to the act of will. Quote 60. We cannot hope to understand what we mean when we say that this is good or that is good, until we understand quite clearly not only what this is or that is, which the natural sciences and philosophy can tell us, but also what is meant by calling them good, a matter which is reserved for ethics only. Moore emphasizes the need to clarify the meaning of good before making ethical judgments. While other disciplines can describe the nature of things, it is the role of ethics to determine what is good. Without a clear understanding of the concept of goodness, ethical reasoning risks becoming confused and fallacious. Quote 61. It follows from the meaning of good and bad that such propositions are all of them, in Kant's phrase, synthetic. They all must rest in the end upon some proposition which must be simply accepted or rejected, which cannot be logically deduced from any other proposition. Moore argues that ethical propositions, like those about good and bad, are synthetic judgments, meaning they cannot be logically derived from other statements. These judgments ultimately rely on self-evident principles, which we accept or reject without further proof, making them fundamental to ethical reasoning. Quote 62. But no dutiful action can possibly have unique value in the sense that it is the sole thing of value in the world, since in that case, every such action would be the sole good thing, which is a manifest contradiction. Moore critiques the notion that any single dutiful action could be uniquely valuable above all else. He argues that actions must be considered in relation to their overall effects on the world, as no individual action holds intrinsic value that overrides all other possible goods. Quote 63. Our duty, therefore, can only be defined as that action which will cause more good to exist in the universe than any possible alternative. Here, Moore defines duty as the action that brings about the greatest amount of good compared to any alternative. This definition ties duty directly to the consequences of actions, emphasizing that the right action is the one that maximizes overall goodness in the world. Quote 64. It is plain that no moral law is self-evident, as has commonly been held by the intuitional school of moralists. Moore challenges the view of intuitionists who believe that certain moral laws are self-evident and require no further justification. He argues that moral judgments about what we ought to do must be evaluated based on empirical investigation and their consequences, not merely on intuitive certainty. Quote 65. The utmost, then, that practical ethics can hope to discover is which, among a few alternatives possible under certain circumstances, will, on the whole, produce the best result. Moore acknowledges the limitations of ethical inquiry, stating that practical ethics can only aim to determine which of a limited set of actions will lead to the best outcomes. He emphasizes that while we can evaluate alternatives, we cannot guarantee that we will always find the optimal solution. Quote 66. The general disutility of murder can only be proved, provided the majority of the human race will certainly persist in existing. Moore acknowledges that the negative effects of murder are clear only under the assumption that humanity continues to exist. If, hypothetically, universal murder led to the extinction of the human race, then ethical judgments about murder would change. This observation highlights that ethical principles often depend on underlying assumptions about human life and society. Quote 67. Industry is a means to the attainment of those necessaries, without which the further attainment of any great positive goods is impossible. Moore points out that industry, or hard work, is valuable because it secures basic necessities, which are essential for achieving higher goods. Without these necessities, pursuing greater positive goods would be difficult or impossible, making industry a foundational aspect of ethical living in most societies. Quote 68. These rules, since they can be recommended as a means to that which is itself only a necessary condition for the existence of any great good, can be defended independently of correct views upon the primary ethical question of what is good in itself. Moore explains that some moral rules, like those that preserve society, can be justified because they enable the conditions necessary for achieving greater goods. These rules do not require a deep understanding of what is intrinsically good, as their utility is evident in maintaining a functioning society. Quote 69. In order to establish this universal general utility, it would be necessary to arrive at a correct view of what is good or evil in itself. Moore emphasizes that to universally justify moral rules, one must understand what is good or evil in itself. Without this fundamental ethical knowledge, it is difficult to make claims about the universal utility of certain rules across different societies or conditions. Quote 70. The fact that an action will be punished is a condition of exactly the same kind as others, of more or less permanence, which must be taken into account in discussing the general utility or disutility of an action in a particular state of society. Moore notes that the existence of punishments influences the ethical evaluation of actions within a society. Punishments act as deterrents and must be considered when assessing whether an action is right or wrong. The potential for punishment can serve as a reason to avoid certain actions, even if those actions might otherwise seem justifiable. Quote 71. The individual can therefore be confidently recommended always to conform to rules which are both generally useful and generally practiced. Moore advises individuals to follow moral rules that are both widely observed and have proven utility. This recommendation is based on the idea that these rules are more likely to produce good outcomes, and breaking them introduces uncertainty and potential harm to society. Quote 72. The true distinction between duties and expedient actions is not that the former are actions which it is in any sense more useful or obligatory or better to perform, but that they are actions which it is more useful to praise and to enforce by sanctions, since they are actions which there is a temptation to omit. Moore explains that the key difference between duties and expedient actions lies in how society responds to them. Duties are actions that society finds it beneficial to praise and enforce because there is a temptation to avoid them, while expedient actions often align more with personal benefit and face less societal enforcement. Quote 73. Self-sacrifice may be a real duty, just as the sacrifice of any single good, whether affecting ourselves or others, may be necessary in order to obtain a better total result. Moore acknowledges that self-sacrifice can be a moral duty when it leads to a greater overall good. The willingness to sacrifice something valuable, whether for oneself or others, may be required in ethical situations where the total benefit outweighs the individual loss. Quote 74. A virtue may be defined as an habitual disposition to perform certain actions, which generally produce the best possible results. Moore defines virtue as a habitual tendency to carry out actions that typically lead to the best overall outcomes. This suggests that virtues are not inherently good, but are valuable because they promote good consequences when consistently practiced. Quote 75. It is as certain as anything can be that very harmful actions may be done from conscientious motives, and that conscience does not always tell us the truth about what actions are right. Moore highlights the fallibility of conscience, noting that actions motivated by a strong sense of moral duty can still lead to harmful outcomes. Conscience alone is not a reliable guide to moral truth, as it can sometimes mislead individuals into believing harmful actions are justifiable. Quote 76. Virtues, therefore, are habitual dispositions to perform actions which are duties, or which would be duties if a volition were sufficient on the part of most men to ensure their performance. Moore suggests that virtues are closely linked to duties and are characterized by habitual behavior that aligns with what is generally regarded as morally required. Virtues represent the tendencies that lead individuals to perform their duties, even when such actions may be challenging or require considerable effort. Quote 77. It is commonly assumed, though wrongly, that to call a thing a virtue means that it has intrinsic value. And on this assumption, the view that virtue does not consist in a mere disposition to do externally right actions does really constitute an advance in ethical truth beyond the ethics of Aristotle. Moore challenges the assumption that virtues are intrinsically valuable. He argues that virtue, as commonly understood, does not automatically imply intrinsic goodness, but instead refers to the disposition to perform right actions. This critique of Aristotle's ethics points out that virtue is better understood as a means to good outcomes rather than being valuable in itself. Quote 78. By far, the most valuable things, which we know or can imagine, are certain states of consciousness, which may be roughly described as the pleasures of human intercourse and the enjoyment of beautiful objects. Moore identifies the highest goods as states of consciousness that involve personal relationships and the appreciation of beauty. These two types of experiences represent the most valuable aspects of life, providing intrinsic worth that goes beyond simple pleasures or material gains. Quote 79. The chief defect of such attempts as have been made by philosophers to construct an ideal to describe the kingdom of heaven seems to consist in the fact that they omit many things of very great positive value, although it is plain that this omission does not enhance the value of the whole. Moore critiques philosophical efforts to describe the ultimate good or ideal states by pointing out that they often exclude significant positive goods. He argues that these omissions do not improve the overall value of the ideal and that a truly valuable ideal must be more inclusive of various goods. Quote 80. It is plain that, though this possibility cannot be denied, no one can have any right to assert that it is realized, that the ideal is something unimaginable. Moore acknowledges the possibility that the absolute ideal might be beyond human imagination, but he argues that no one can justifiably claim this as a fact. He insists that any proposed ideal must be based on things we can imagine and know to be good, rather than hypothesizing about something entirely beyond our understanding. Quote 81. A whole, which contained all these parts, might not be so valuable as some other whole, from which certain positive goods were omitted. Moore explains that a perfect whole may not necessarily contain every possible good. In some cases, omitting certain positive elements can create a more valuable whole, reflecting his belief in the complexity of ethical value, where more is not always better. Quote 82. We shall never be entitled to assert that this whole is perfection, but we shall be entitled to assert that it is better than any other which may be presented as a rival. Moore stresses that while we cannot claim to know the ultimate perfection or absolute ideal, we can still compare and assess various proposed ideals. Through such comparison, we can determine which state is better than others, even if we cannot reach a conclusion about perfection. Quote 83. Personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments include all the greatest, and by far the greatest, goods we can imagine. Moore emphasizes that personal relationships and the enjoyment of beauty make up the most significant and valuable aspects of life. These experiences are central to human well-being and represent the highest goods that we can conceive, standing as the foundation of any ethical ideal. Quote 84. It appears probable that the beautiful should be defined as that of which the admiring contemplation is good in itself. Moore suggests that beauty can be understood as something that evokes admiring contemplation, which in itself is intrinsically valuable. This definition removes the subjectivity often associated with beauty and anchors it in the value of the experience it provokes. Quote 85. True belief in the reality of an object greatly increases the value of many valuable wholes. Moore argues that when an object we believe to be real truly exists, the overall value of that belief and experience is significantly enhanced. The truth of the belief adds a layer of value that imagination or false beliefs cannot provide, making the reality of the object important to the value of the whole experience. Quote 86. A state of things in which they, material properties, are included must be vastly better than any conceivable state in which they were absent. Moore contends that material qualities, even if they have little intrinsic value on their own, are essential parts of valuable wholes. A state of being that includes both spiritual and material properties is superior to one that excludes material aspects, since the appreciation of beauty in nature or art relies on these material qualities. Quote 87. The appreciation of what has great intrinsic value is so valuable as the appreciation of what is merely beautiful. Here, Moore highlights the immense value found in appreciating things that hold great intrinsic worth. He points out that the act of admiring something for its intrinsic value can be as significant as admiring something purely for its aesthetic beauty, indicating the importance of both intellectual and emotional engagements with what is good. Quote 88. The study of what is valuable in human intercourse is a study of immense complexity, and that there may be much human intercourse which has little or no value, or is positively bad. Moore emphasizes the complexity of understanding the value of human relationships, acknowledging that not all interactions are valuable. In fact, some human connections may hold no value or even contribute negatively, underlining the need for careful reflection in judging what makes human relationships good. Quote 89. Though something utterly unknown might be better than any world containing either them or any other good we know, yet we have no reason to suppose that anything whatever would be better than a state of things in which they were included. Moore acknowledges the possibility that an ideal world beyond our imagination could exist, but he argues that, based on our current understanding, no world could be better than one that includes material properties. He suggests that dismissing the value of the material world would be speculative and unsupported by our knowledge of what is good. Quote 90. The presence of pleasure makes a contribution to the value of good wholes greatly in excess of its own intrinsic value. Moore emphasizes that while pleasure itself may not hold great intrinsic value, when it is part of a greater good, it significantly enhances the value of that whole. The combination of pleasure with other positive elements creates a more valuable state than the sum of its parts. Quote 91. The infliction of pain on a person whose state of mind is bad may, if the pain be not too intense, create a state of things that is better on the whole than if the evil state of mind had existed unpunished. Moore argues that inflicting pain on someone with a harmful mindset can improve the overall state of affairs, provided the pain is not extreme. This introduces a form of moral reasoning that justifies certain kinds of punishment as leading to a lesser evil. Quote 92. It may, supposing one evil already exists, be worthwhile to create another, since, by the mere creation of this second, there may be constituted a whole less bad than if the original evil had been left to exist by itself. Moore suggests that in some cases, introducing a second evil can lead to a less harmful overall situation than allowing the first evil to persist unchecked. This principle is particularly relevant to moral decisions, where mitigating harm is the goal. Quote 93. The appropriate mental attitude towards a really existing evil contains, of course, an element which is absolutely identical with the same attitude towards the same evil, where it is purely imaginary. Moore points out that the way we respond mentally to actual evils mirrors how we respond to imagined ones. The emotional reaction and cognition are identical in both cases, but the presence of real evil adds a negative element that diminishes the overall value of the situation. Quote 94. There seems no reason to think that any actual evil whatsoever would be contained in the ideal. Moore concludes that the ideal world would not include any form of real evil. He refutes arguments that suggest evil is necessary for greater goods, asserting that true perfection must be free from any actual evil or suffering. Quote 95. The appreciation of tragedy is a great positive good, and it seems almost equally certain that the virtues of compassion, courage, and self-control contain such goods. Moore asserts that even though tragedy and suffering are often considered negative, their appreciation and the virtues they inspire, like compassion and courage, are undeniably positive goods. These experiences and virtues contribute to the richness of ethical and aesthetic life. Principia Ethica by G.E. Moore concludes with a reaffirmation of the central idea that goodness cannot be defined through natural properties or equated with any single naturalistic concept, such as pleasure or evolutionary success. Moore's concept of the naturalistic fallacy serves as a caution against oversimplifying ethical discussions, underscoring the need for careful analysis of what truly holds intrinsic value. The book encourages readers to look beyond mere empirical observations and consider the deeper, indefinable qualities that constitute the good, offering a profound reflection on the complexities of moral philosophy and the pursuit of ethical clarity.
Curious to dive into the mind of G.E. Moore? With StudyLab Pro's Book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Principia Ethica in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.